It is said that Prophet Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Umar, and also Uthman, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, and the rest of A'imah would make a decision based on even only one witness and swearing by the Quran. There was some dispute that happened after Muhammad died. People wanted to cancel out the physical gifts that he had left behind. They wanted to annul the right of inheritance. The revelation and the direct inspiration, it could be said, came to an end. We know from the longest verse in Al-Quran that a man's testimony is not listed as equal to that of two women. It's that the women can be said to be given an advantage in testimony in terms of if one woman forgets something, then the other woman can fill stuff in. So, if nothing's forgotten, just only the one woman can speak. Now, only the one woman is needed to speak. It's fine to cut things off as necessary. It's also fine to include more than the necessary testimony to what goes on. And of course, there's context here in terms of, this is about debts and putting debts into writing and taking witnesses, and even if you don't like to put these things down, even family, it's important to put things down if a debt's going to be held. And some of the spoils from Bahrain didn't reach the community until after Muhammad had died, and the call was put out for anybody with the claim. So obviously his daughter and his wives would have borne claim to that, as the verses indicate. And Abu Bakr refused to accept the witness of the couple women that testified that Fatima was specifically told, you're going to get a share of this. Because the verse says, 2 men are 1 man and 2 women. But then we have the verses of inheritance, so that's also the question of that. But common reasoning can draw some things out. Ya Bani Adam qad anzalna alaykum liyasan yuwarris sawatikum warishan wa libasu taqwa dhalik leka leka min ayatelahum yadakarun. And to make things even more clear, we have the reminder well, that verse was not the verse that referred to what we were going to talk about, but we are reminded that clothing is for the purpose of righteousness, and that we're meant to cover our nakedness. And it can also aid to the pleasingness of things. And no, we're not body shaming when we tell people to be modest in public, or, and no, it's not, oh, well, if it's all the same gender, then there's still a degree of modesty. And I don't know where the verse is because it's obviously not there, but we have a verse after which Muhammad said that Fadak was his, and there's the talking about giving the due to the needy, the wayfarer, and squandering not, and give to the near of kin his due, and the needy, the wayfarer. Yeah, the near of kin. I obviously recognize the verse, but I don't know where it is. And Fadak was a place near Medina. And there was a settlement of peace in the 7th year, Al-Hijrah. And Fadak was surrendered so that there wouldn't be a war later. And Qadir. And thus we see the Prophet Muhammad, and by analogy, the Islamic State, has, of course, a share from the spoils of war. And God chooses what power individuals have over anyone or another. And if there is a case of adultery or other crime, then the child of the woman who is thus punished goes to the husband, or if it's somebody else's child, then it goes to it would go to okay, that's a slightly tricky one, but sometimes the guy ends up raising a kid that's not his, as if it was his. I have encountered a case where 3 or 4 people may have been paying preemptive child support in regards to an individual, and it doesn't appear like they're even pregnant, much much less, but they're doing this cloak of secrecy, like, oh, well, it's because everybody's so private, and it's like, I don't think that's how it works. And your real kin is, by blood in marriage. It's not, oh, you have a friend, and sure, you can bequeath a portion of your estate to people, but Ziyad was thus tricked, and Abu Sufyan had told Umar that he was afraid of him, or he would have done the same thing to try to assert a kinship between them. And even in the early Islamic leadership, it was or you could say before, some of the people were products of prostitution and stuff like this, and it wasn't held against them. And once you had the rights and such in society, that was also not, held up. Like, we're trying to bring back this thing that if you have ancestry, it's like something happened with all our ancestors. Like, anybody, if you have Scottish ancestry, there's a good chance that the British or somebody else enslaved you at some point. I mean, they enslaved your ancestors, but it's not you. So injustice isn't addressed, and things are left to the side. And one thing that we're to be careful of is this raising and leveling the ground. Sure, you can level out a foundation, but it's overdone, so we need to be careful not to overdo these sorts of things. And we shouldn't use the mention of injustice to create further disturbance. We can address the injustice. If there's an issue with a couple police officers, we shouldn't make it a whole country thing. And we should never make an issue because of one being from one group and another being from another group. That should have absolutely nothing to do with it. And it was important to trace out the evidence. You think a group did something? Well, don't do anything until you actually figure out whether they did something or not. And Muawiyah, of course, they waited in the valley of Zi Khashad near Medina. And this is before Uthman was killed. And after the killing was done, then they had to wait. It was like, wait, shouldn't they have stayed to deal with the issue, the problems? If, or did they say the problems made the person died? That makes the whole thing super suspicious, right? I know I'm meandering a bit, but I'm going over some things, right? Now, the people of Kufa, during the time of Ali, had fallen into a bit where they were like, they don't want to go to war. Now, you shouldn't want to go to war just to go to war or something like that, but when it's the right thing, one should never want to hold back on these sorts of things. And you can offer the excuse of being disabled or whatever, but you got to make sure to make the valid excuse. And if you are disabled, you should want to certainly still want to take part in things. If you're poor, you would still want to do good if you had the means. Now, if you develop that mentality, when the people who do end up getting the means unexpectedly, it works towards enabling them to do at least what's obliged upon them with their needs. With you know, with their with what they have, and even to go further than that and do better. And people deputized into positions should be given the information and the other means to be able to accomplish what they are going to accomplish. And one thing that will deter people sometimes is the mentioning of the greatness of one's character. But in general, you don't make that about listing out your good deeds or something. You encourage people in all these different ways, and you know, and you just lead by example, and you tell people not to brag about how in which areas you are superior, and you don't chase people away from the things of this world. You invite them to the things of this world in the context of religion. A leader is supposed to improve the economic, the social, and of course, among the social, the educational situation of society. And if a lesson seems to be forgotten, it might be time to change what sort of sermon you're going to give. Lost information is important to remind people of. That's why we have scholars, not to repeat the same stuff that everybody's saying, but to bring out some variety of other teachings that we can use. Now, of course, correct teachings upon what's revealed and what's inspired, the Quran and what the Prophet was spiritually motivated to do. Way too many sayings about how he walked around rooms, or, how much water he called for when he was on the way to the bathroom or something like that. But we need to use our opportunity, for it's too late. We need to remember that there is negativity in life, but to distinguish negativity from evil, we need to prepare for the moment of death. We need to not merely fear or merely have guilt or merely have shame. It's not the point to approach these things. Now, if we have belief, we will have a fear of doing the wrong thing, of believing the wrong thing. We will have guilt or shame in regards to what we've done, or even what we could have done. But it's not to wallow around in those sorts of feelings. That's not the point. Some people, they will do a severe action, and it pleases themselves emotionally. But more action is needed to actually please themselves. And the approach of death, when the action along the way is right, when you're giving up your life because you're engaging in Jad al-Asghar, the little struggle, you don't know if you're actually going to die as a rule. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tabbat yada bila
Prasadam Magnan Humalavamakasam Seyaslanarandatalam Wamratu Hamalatalhatam Fijida Hablum Masad.
It's not the direct name, but this that we just went over is the only case in Al-Quran where somebody who is the enemy of Muhammad spoke out. I mean, they're mentioned by name, and they're mentioned by name to serve a lesson. And it was the curse against the father of flames that his means are stifled, and ultimately their worldly means weren't going to benefit them whether they were stifled in this world or not. And his wife was also taking part. Some wives are supportive but not directly taking part in things, but this was not the case. And she was going to endure the consequences as well. And we learn from that and other passages how to actually curse. It's about binding from doing wrong. It's about teaching a lesson, binding from doing wrong, so then, it becomes a thing in the battlefield. Now, I saw a video posted and to say, why did the Muslims do this? It was the Muslims. We know from Sunni narrations that the people who did this will go to hell. So therefore, it was the Muslims who killed this innocent person. I mean, not just innocent in terms of blameless, in terms of, something that would be worthy of death, but innocent in other ways too. And Hassan and Hussein are examples of the youth of paradise. And Prophet Muhammad told us that. And there are other examples of people being, the youth of hell. Now, Utbah bin Mu'it was somebody that was given the tidings of hell during his life, him and his sons. But by youths, of course, we're meaning that they have reached the age of accountability, because in the Islamic vision, I mean, even if you don't know the context, in the Islamic vision, nobody is kept from paradise unless they reach the age of accountability and start sinning and disbelieving in, that stage of independent morality and ability to choose based on their means, which is normal adolescence. There are narrations that indicate that, well, I shouldn't say narrations, I'm certain there's at least one narration where the prophet said one of the signs of the end times, something to this effect, is that people will hit puberty, but their minds will not be there yet. And that's not the level of immaturity where 30 is the new 12, right? Because you expect people to finally accept a sense of responsibility that used to be the standard for a 12-year-old when they're 30. Whether they accept it or not, that type of immaturity is totally someone's fault. And people say ditzy like it's some sort of insult. As it turns out, ditzy was, innocent, no, not innocence necessarily, but, the energy and not dragged down by the world and all that yet. And nothing wrong with being hyper and all that other stuff, you know. Some people are quite old when they're still, what you say, ditzy. It doesn't actually directly have anything to do with a sense of um, incapability to make their own decisions or something with what they have or something. People make a habit of making bad decisions, but, you know, it's part of the prejudice against women is the thing, misogyny. That's where you get stuff. Now, there are tribes of allies. And there are people that just aren't the thing. Islam doesn't quite have this approach that, oh, if you're not in alliance with us, you're against us. So there was no conquering by anything even closely resembling an Islamic State of areas that just weren't Muslim. There's no, they're not Muslims, so it's the field of physical war. Yeah, certainly you go spread your faith and all that stuff, and if people are attacked for practicing and talking about Islam in some countries, then it becomes the field of war. But if it's not, again, it wasn't the thing, even if they're your next door neighbors. And you shouldn't go out of your way to translate another thing into other terms about how, oh, well, if it's more than a month's journey, don't do it. Going out of your way for war. Now, if they're of a near group, then you can attack them near and far when they've started a war with you. But, a person could also say, if they're not a neighboring country, if there's countries in between and all that. And it's narrated that as much as for Allahu Akbar in the funeral prayer, some people, some martyrs were prayed over with 14 or 70 or some other number. And one of the things, because whoever leads the prayer should be wary of those behind them. This is almost never done, and in general shouldn't be done, because you're trying to get a congregation together, and standing for an hour to do a funeral prayer or 2 hours or something is just that's going too far. But if it's a small group that and that sort of thing, that it's not going to be too difficult, then there could be said to be nothing wrong with it. One of the reasons why you could say that there was problems with Aisha for a little bit there, to which she repented of after the Battle of Jamal, was because she was driven out of her home. People buried Muhammad in her home, and then Abu Bakr next to him, and then and then Umar, and it wasn't the fact that she had to step aside in her own home to say voluntary prayers in her home and put stuff in front of her in her own home, but eventually they drove her out. And eventually people went to the extremism of making the large graves and all that other stuff. In Islamic vision, diagonally across the hand is the size of the grave that a person should set forth. But people even built shrines over Muhammad's grave. Now, the Islamic vision also doesn't allow us to go, oh, they did something outside the faith, we're going to tear this stuff down. If it's in the masjid, yeah, we don't do this. Now, you could say they built the masjid, they extended the masjid around the grave. But there's things in the middle, and it's like they should have just buried him in the graveyard with everybody else. But again, this is something that was done after Muhammad, with decisions after Muhammad, so you can't say, oh, well, the early community, they did this, and over time it built up to this, and no one wants to take it down, and it's like, well, you know, because it's this obscene edifice with all this silver and all this. And isn't there gold as part of the whole thing, too? One of the reasons for innocence after Muhammad died is the continual mapping of the spiritual path. Not just the preserving of the teachings, but the continual mapping of the path that the Muslimin were supposed to be upon. Muawiyah had started some making distinctions among the people after Muhammad died. Abu Bakr was honored for being the person to organize the Muslimin the most, and Umar was the most victorious in battle, and he also established towns and cities. And Uthman was more about spreading religion. Now, Ali accomplished, of these three things, people became more united, but the pure expansion, I don't know enough off the top of my head to make a judgment about that. The propagation of religion, you could say that more teachings came through him than any of the others, than even the first three combined. I think you're going to have to come with quite the evidence or reasoning to say that that wasn't the case. The others did their job. In Medina, Yanba, and Suwa'a, Ali had springs dug and had canals built so that there could be irrigation. And al-Muslimin, those who have submitted to God, the legal Muslim, they were entrusted with these things. So Ali sort of handed over his, almost all of his wealth to help out the people. And some things are said in different ways, or they're said with additional information, so it's important to repeat of them. But let us remember that we should lead guidance for the people in terms of our true will. That when our greatest will, we should discourage some things and encourage other things. We should not dislike or stay away from mere death. We should adhere to the greater inheritance of the prophets, realizing that the exemplar and messenger prophetship is not something that is inherited, and there's not any more of that. Physical prophethood was not made. Physical property wasn't made distinct. You're going to have some evidence brought forward that the prophet says, with exception to me or to us, we have this. Like, for example, they didn't receive charity. So charity was not something towards them, neither the obligatory nor the voluntary. They could receive gifts. And inheritance was also listed as something. And, the idea that there'd be a part in the Quran that, didn't have, that would mention inheritance, but it wouldn't mention an exception there, that you'd have to dig throughout it. The Quran itself would mention no exception to this stuff. That would, that would create an issue, because the Quran is supposed to be the final word.